Well, if you believe the media, then climate change is the great doom of our time, and policymakers are all rushing to do something about it, especially and specifically to get to net zero as quickly as possible. In fact, the future of human civilization depends on it. And if you just consumed mainstream media, then you'd think that that was the state of play. But thankfully, there are people who are actually looking behind the headlines at what's really going on. And one such person is Ross Clark. He joins me now. Ross, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Pleasure.
Now, you've actually published a paper at Net Zero Watch titled The Retreat from Net Zero. You're observing something very different to what the media are telling us about. What have you observed?
Well, I mean, if you go back to COP28, I mean, all these sort of countries were signing communiques saying we're going to phase out fossil fuels, phase down fossil fuels, and so on. But you look at actually what these countries are doing. Qatar, UAE, who hosted the conference, they're investing £20 billion to increase by 50% their oil output.
Mm,
Brazil, which, is now seen as a sort of a climate hero by sort of environmentalists because President Lula is not Bolsonaro, and he's sort of, trying to retreat on trying to stop the sort of deforestation. But he wants to increase fossil fuel oil and gas production, become the world's fourth largest producer.
mm,
Canada, which was spoiling for the communique to be tougher, they're increasing their oil and gas output. American gas output never been higher. I mean that's the sort of reality behind it. All these countries who will go to COP28 and nod along with the environmentalists and so on. I mean, they accept that fossil fuels are going to be around for quite a while yet. Maybe we offset their emissions. We use carbon capture and storage and so on, which US are very keen on doing. But you cannot just take fossil fuels away from the global economy and expect the economy to thrive. I mean, it would be sort of mass poverty, back
mm.
to the caves, as the chairman of COP28, president of COP28 said. There's a sort of reality to it that's sort of creeping back into the debate after years, I think, of people say, oh, setting these targets and just hoping for the best that
Mm,
sort of technology will sort of magically appear in
mm,
order to fulfill this target. It's very, very severe targets that we've set ourselves to decarbonize the economies by 2050,
mm.
and the technology is just not there at the moment, and I don't think that any country ultimately is going to impoverish itself to achieve that target. I think we're going to beginning to see more of a reality as these targets sort of collide head on with the reality of what it's going to cost us,
Mm.
and
Well, reality
the
has a wa-
pain it's going to inflict on people.
Well, reality has a way of winning in the end. We saw, of course, a reality check with the outbreak of war in Ukraine, and that, of course, had a very significant impact on Europe's energy supplies, particularly heading into that winter that immediately followed that. But your report is available from netzerowatch.com. I have read the entire thing. Your opening chapter, really after the introduction, is actually about the fact that fossil fuel demand has never been higher. So you mentioned there are a bunch of countries that were increasing production. But from your research, it's not just that they're saying, hey, we're going to produce more, but actually, we as consumers are using more despite the amount of money that is being spent on things like industrial grid scale solar and wind.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there are. I mean, if you look at Britain, you look at America, European countries, so they're actually reducing their overall carbon emissions. But globally, use of fossil fuels, the carbon emissions are still creeping upwards.
Mm,
And the reason for that is what we're doing in Europe, and to a lesser extent in America, is we're offshoring our emissions. I mean, the UK government, for example, claims that we've claims to have halved carbon emissions since 1990. But, that's on a territorial basis. That just counts the
Sure.
emissions which are physically spewed out within Britain, it excludes the emissions that are emitted elsewhere in the world in the course of creating food and other products for UK consumers. And if you
Mm,
look at it on a consumption basis, it's the reduction in UK carbon emissions is very, very much lower than it is on the territorial basis.
mm.
And the reason for that is, a lot of our production's been offshore to China, and Chinese emissions, of course, are surging.
Well, they are single handedly replacing the entire Australian economy from a CO2 emissions point of view multiple times over every single year. Now, you mentioned in your report, or you go through in your report, a lot of these other technologies that have been the things that people have pinned their hopes on. They've said hydrogen is going to be the thing that allows us to get to net zero, or it's going to be industrial scale wind and solar, or the development of better batteries, grid scale batteries, heat pumps, these sorts of things. You go through these, each of them in turn, including, and I was very saddened to see actually one of my great hopes, which is small modular reactors. You're not particularly bullish on those either. Could you talk us through a few of these technologies and why it is that they're not driving the kind of change that has been promised?
Yeah, well, I mean, take small nuclear reactors. I mean, I think they could still be part of the energy mix.
Mm,
But even in the best case scenario, I was speaking to Rolls-Royce the other day about this. They are planning, hopefully, to have a small nuclear reactor producing electricity by 2035.
right.
And they say, well, we'll scale them up. We'll have about 20 of them, but they're not really expecting the market to go very much further than that.
Mm,
And you think that the amount of electricity that's likely to be generated by small modular reactors will not even replace the electricity that's sort of currently being generated by our aging nuclear power stations, which are all due to close by 2035, bar
mm,
one, by one in Sizewell B in Suffolk, will be the only one going by 2035, and Hinkley C in Somerset, if we ever get there, if that ever gets completed.
mm,
So, I mean, nuclear power is actually going backwards in Britain and across the world as well. Germany's closed all its nuclear plants. France has, invested in them more than any other advanced country, but uh, they're not building any more really. They're not expanding nuclear as a proportion of the electricity.
mm,
Um, US hasn't really sort of gone into um, nuclear power in a big way since Three Mile Island in 1979.
sure.
So, the UK government, for example, has a plan to decarbonize the electricity system entirely by 2035. Well, there's no way that there is going to be nuclear capacity in
Mm.
2035 to do the job. So, it's being, wind and solar are being talked up, but then you've got the problem of storage and
Mm,
backup
mm.
for when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining.
So, given this disconnect, this growing disconnect between what they're actually doing, the deadlines are looming, the realities are coming home to roost, the costs are becoming increasingly obvious, and yet the rhetoric doesn't seem to be changing. They came out of COP28, yes, with a relatively mealy-mouthed, watered-down statement, but honestly, I would characterise most of the outcomes of the COP20 of the COP type conferences and climate conferences as pretty mealy-mouthed and pretty equivocal in their nature. So, I don't see that as a big departure. Where to from here? At what point do the politicians have to start acknowledging these realities in their rhetoric, or are they just going to keep on writing checks with their mouths that the technologies just simply cannot cash?
Well, I mean, what's going on at the moment is that the long-term target net zero by 2050 that remains in place, and I think that no political party in the West is yet brave enough to say that we're going to revise that target.
Mm,
But it's the sort of interim targets which are falling by the wayside, the
right.
sort of banning electric cars, forcing people to fit heat pumps and the houses rather than banning gas boilers and
Mm,
so on. It's all those targets. As soon as they collide with reality, is they get put back, they get delayed. But of course, it's going to get to a point where you keep delaying those targets, and well, of course, the people say, well, the 2050 target, there's no
Mm,
way you can hit that
mm,
2050 target. Well, there's no way, they could ever hit that 2050 target. But at some point, it's going to become glaringly obvious that, that 2050 business net zero is not going to happen.
mm.
But I don't think any political party in the next in the West in the next 5, 10 years is going to be brave enough to say that. But sort of
Mm.
beyond that, I think the net zero target itself will be watered down.
Well, I think you're probably spot on, and of course, the silver lining for our current crop of politicians is that they'll be long gone from politics by the time the reality of the 2050 deadline becomes clear to everybody. They will have already retired and pensioned themselves off. Well, Ross, thank you so much for writing this report. We will put the link into the description of this video so that people can find it and read it for themselves. I've read it from cover to cover. I highly recommend it. Very, very interesting and certainly grim reading. If you're one of those people that believes that we have to decarbonise the economy, then this is certainly a bit of a reality check. Ross, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.